Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You have walked past them. You've probably walked through them. It is impossible to live in a Canadian city today without coming face to face with the results of the housing crisis, the drug crisis, and the pandemic in the now familiar form of tents in a park. How much do any of us know, though, about what goes on in these encampments? About who exactly is living in them? There's definitely a lot that we think goes on there, especially when our fellow citizens call on police and politicians to get those tents out of their neighborhoods.
Drug trafficking, firearms, break and enter, theft, assaults, fighting, intimidation, garbage, public defecation.
Listen, nobody denies that these encampments can be unsafe. Even the people living in them would agree with that. But again, there's a lot you and I don't know, because the issue has become so politicized. It can be almost impossible to get a real inside look. Today, though, we have a guest who did get one. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Brennan Doherty is a Toronto-based writer who wrote a fantastic piece about encampments and the people who live there for The Local. Hello, Brennan.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
You are most welcome. As I mentioned, it's one of the best pieces I've read about actual life inside these encampments rather than how the rest of the city views them from the outside.
Yeah, no, it's thank you. Yeah, it was a real pleasure to be able to do this and to really get the time to sit and listen to people in these encampments as opposed to kind of doing the parachute journalism that we're sometimes forced to do and often doesn't produce terribly great work.
Well, why don't you start by telling us, I guess, about the person you probably spent the most time with. Who is David Sesasheli, and how did you first meet him?
So David is a bit of a mystery, to be honest. He is originally from Georgia, the country, not the U.S. state. He has done many things in his life. He has made wine in Georgia. He has worked on construction in Greece and in the U.S. He told my photographer, Nick Kozak, that he was an ice road trucker at one point in Canada. But by the time I got to meet him, he was living in Clarence Square Park, which at the time was the biggest recorded encampment in Toronto. It's right in the downtown. He had been there for about a year when we first got there. And I guess I would describe him for people who maybe haven't seen the photographs or haven't met him, is he's actually he seems very quiet and surly, but he's actually got this very warm personality. If you walk up to him, he is very polite. He will shake your hand. He will invite you to sit down. He will give you food or water. I thought of him as kind of the encampment like grandfather or uncle figure, like he's kind of watching out for people. There's a lot of stuff in his past we don't know a lot about, and he sometimes talks in circles. I got to meet him through Nick Kozak, the photographer for this piece. Nick had known him for about 4 years. He'd met him in 2020. And when we were actually assigned this piece by The Local, Nick was told to kind of go out and see if he could find some of the people he had photographed in the past. And Nick had no idea where David was. And Nick went out to this encampment because he'd seen it and ran into David again for the first time in years. The thing with the reporting for this story is it's unlike any other kind of reporting I've ever done because you have no idea where people are. Like you could meet someone at an encampment and they could even be like, yeah, I want to talk to you. Let's meet up next week. And then you could come back the next week and they're gone. And you have no idea where they went. So it was like really a stroke of luck that Nick was able to find him. And then Nick introduced me to David from there. And it took a little while, but eventually we got to know each other at that point.
And what did you learn about, and I guess there are stories obviously for everyone who ends up in an encampment like Clarence Square, about how David found himself living in an encampment in downtown Toronto?
So again, this is where it gets a bit tricky because I interviewed him a couple of times and spent quite a bit of time with him. And there's some parts of his story that he wouldn't fully corroborate, but what it seems to be is that he was working in construction. He went through a pretty nasty divorce, and he started drinking quite heavily. He eventually fell behind on rent and was evicted. He bounced around a bunch of different places. Nick actually met him at an encampment that no longer exists in 2020, and he would kind of bounce around from encampment to encampment. He lived under the Bathurst Street Bridge at one point, and then he ended up at Clarence Square through a really interesting turn of events. He actually had gotten housing. He had gotten kind of supportive housing at a facility kind of very, very close to the downtown, almost at the lake. He was actually living there for a little while. I want to say a year, 2 years. And then he was evicted. He claims that he was bringing basically friends in through the window or inviting people in. He's a very generous man. If he has one bottle of water, he will split half of it with you. And that's kind of what he was doing. He was letting people crash at his place. And he is kind of a hoarder. He likes to bring a lot of stuff and have a lot of stuff around him. And he was doing that in his apartment. And he apparently came back one night and the locks were changed. And so he was kicked out. And I thought that there was this going to be this complicated process as to how he ended up at Clarence Square. And he basically just said, I saw tents.
Right.
Because where he was evicted was not far from here. And he just went, because, he'd had experience living on the street. And I get, he had seen tents and said, okay, this is where I'm going to be for the next little while.
So for people who haven't seen it or who aren't familiar with these encampments in their city or town, which is probably vanishingly few Canadians at this point, though, can you describe the Clarence Square encampment? Because, again, as you mentioned, one of the largest, certainly in the city, if not the country.
Yeah, so I will say encampments fluctuate quite a bit.
Right. In
size, in terms of who goes there. For the kind of the majority of the time that Nick and I were there, I would say there was anywhere from maybe a dozen to 20, 25 tents. The encampment was kind of on this grassy part of this park, wedged between Spadina Avenue, which is a major, major street in downtown Toronto, this dog park, and a series of condos. The condos actually surround the encampment, which is really weird visually. There's kind of a central ring of tents, big tents. David's tent was one of the biggest, and it was kind of near the center. And then basically, the longer you'd been in the encampment, kind of the closer you got to the center. If you would just join the encampment, you wouldn't be allowed on the inside. You'd be kind of expected to have your tent more towards the outside. But these tents are of all different varieties. Some of them are small, kind of 2-person pup tents. Some of them are a lot bigger than that. David's, I always thought of as it was kind of the size of an RV. Actually, I went into his tent once with him. It was really ingenious, actually. He built this shelter that was a series of tarps, and then he actually had a pup tent inside that shelter. There was a generator that they had in the center of the camp, and they'd kind of built a wooden shelter around it to protect it from the rain and the elements. And it had lines kind of snaking out along the ground, going into people's tents to power things. Because that's really important. I mean, in the summer, it's not so bad, but in the winter, one of the very dangerous methods that people use to keep warm is they'll burn hand sanitizer, and they'll sometimes do it inside their tents. And so the generator allows them to actually hook up, electrical heaters or something, which again, maybe isn't perfect, but it's certainly better than freezing to death.
And how do they have their basic needs taken care of in terms of bathrooms, water, showers, that kind of stuff?
Right. So in terms of water, there's a bit of cruelty in this, I think, but there actually is a functioning water fountain in Clarence Square Park, but it's actually for dogs. And so they will be able to, if they can't buy or acquire water in other ways, they can get water that way. In terms of showers, there are a couple of community centers not too far from the encampment. And we actually heard from quite a few residents that a lot of those community centers will let them in for free to shower. The community centers kind of know that maybe they don't know that they're in Clarence Square Park, but they know that they're not doing well. Mm-hmm. There's actually a gas station right across the road from the encampment. I was told by several people that their employees will let them in to use the bathroom there. There is actually a porta potty on the site, but the interesting thing is there's actually supposed to be 2. The city promised to have 2 in by April for the residents. They only have 1, and I have not gone inside it. It's pretty gnarly. They were supposed to have a second installed in April. They haven't installed it yet. They've actually installed 2 other porta potties at the edge of the encampment, but they're locked with padlocks. And they promised to have a second porta potty installed now by November. So it's a little better than you might expect, but it's still pretty rough. It's not a good place to live. And I think most of the residents, if not all the residents, would agree to that.
How do the residents of the encampment talk about their relationship with the surrounding community and vice versa? Is there friction there? Are they, by now, it's been there for a while, in a kind of live and let live situation? What's that like?
It's tense, to put it mildly. I would say that the encampment residents very much feel like they are kind of under siege from the world, really. And we've witnessed, a lot of people in the area or people passing through the area will kind of make a point of walking by their tents and taking cell phone video, and that really bothers them. A couple of the residents we've talked to have said that they've been kind of yelled at or belittled by people in the people walking by, we're taxpayers and we're paying for you to do this kind of thing. So they definitely don't have a great relationship with people kind of living in the area. I'll also say that sometimes there can be violence between people who are not living in the area, but are perhaps from other encampments or elsewhere coming in and starting trouble. So I'd say it's not a great relationship. And then people who own condos or apartments or live in the area, they definitely want this gone. I would say that the range of frustration kind of goes from people who want the best for people in the encampment, but say this shouldn't be here, all the way to people that are get these people out of here. I don't care. This has gone on too long. I did speak to some condo residents, and they have said, their garages are broken into all the time and bikes are stolen, and that they can't walk their dogs in the park anymore. Some of them actually describe it as a no-go zone. They kind of feel like Clarence Square Park is a place that they cannot be. So I would say that overall the relationship is very, very tense.
What do residents of encampments say about why they stay there as opposed to a city-run shelter or other options, if those options even exist?
Yeah, so I will say that almost no one really wants to be in encampments. It is not a free and happy choice that they make. It is a choice of desperation. But I will say that they often choose to go in encampments over city shelters because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, there may not be capacity in city shelters. They may have no other option. In many cases, there's a great concern that shelters are dangerous places. And in some ways, I get it. If you're cramming, in some cases, a couple of dozen people who don't know each other and who are honestly having the worst days of their lives into one room, you're imposing kind of restrictions on them that a lot of us would actually compare to prison. You can't be out after 10 p.m., lights out are at a certain time. You can't bring pets with you. You can't have a drink or whatever. And I don't just mean you can't get drunk. I mean you can't have anything. And so you add all these together. And then, of course, the pandemic in many ways was the perfect disease to spread in shelters, right? So you add all this together and there's a real distrust. I will say that, many people do live in shelters and choose that option. But for the people in encampments that we met, a lot of them were either just did not like the rules, really couldn't abide by them, in that a lot of shelters, I think pretty much every shelter in Toronto doesn't allow you to be using drugs or alcohol. And there are certain addictions, particularly alcohol, where if you're a heavy, heavy drinker, stopping for a day can actually be dangerous.
Right.
You can get, delirium tremens, which can kill you. So you add all this together, and there's just this general perception that shelters are unsafe. They're not friendly places. They're not good places. And honestly, you don't get a guaranteed spot in a shelter for long sometimes. So you might have this situation of, well, I have a bed for a week, but am I going to get it next week? I don't know. And an encampment, in a weird way, offers a kind of stability. So yeah, there's a bunch of different reasons, but those are some of the big ones.
The encampment offers stability unless police show up and clear the whole thing out, which camps in Toronto and in other cities have seen. What is the current policy on that? How often does that happen? I know the high-profile ones were maybe a couple of years ago. What's going on right now with that?
So the city has what it calls kind of a human rights approach based to encampments, which is it's kind of more or less committed to trying to find shelter, housing, addiction, and health supports to people in encampments now. And this is especially true for the big encampments. So they don't necessarily call it out in city documents, but it seems pretty clear that there were a series of very violent encampment evictions in the summer of 2021 in Toronto.
Right.
And the backlash from, honestly, a lot of ordinary people was overwhelming. Like, this was well before I started working on the story. And I remember, like, a lot of my friends, some of whom were not news readers, being like, what is going on? Why are we doing this? So the city has kind of changed tack, or says it's changed tack. And it's started trying to do what it sees as kind of like pretty proactive outreach to people, trying to get them on housing lists, trying to get them indoors, trying to get them to seek offers of shelter. And that is a big change from, 2021, where they were offering shelter, but it was during the height of the pandemic and there weren't many options. And if people didn't accept, the kind of initial response is, well, we're just going to clear you out of the park. What we're seeing now is kind of a little more subtle in that, as much as the city says it's taking a human rights approach to encampments, they are still leaving themselves room to evict people. And they are still doing that on a smaller scale. So Clarence Square Park, for instance, over the course of reporting this story, didn't have a mass scale clearing like we saw at Trinity Bellwoods Park, which is one of the big parks in Toronto. But it did, the city would come in and say, oh, well, David's tent is unsanitary or unhealthy, so we're going to bulldoze it. And they did, actually, towards the end of our reporting process. Now, he did have another one and he was able to stay, but they're not going to clear the whole encampment, but they'll clear parts of it. Or what often happens with very small encampments, like we're talking 2, 3, 4 people, is they'll just clear the whole thing. They don't say this in documents, so I am kind of extrapolating from what I've read, but it does seem to me that the city is trying to ensure that encampments cannot grow big enough to the point where they would have to do something like they did in 2021. But for the encampments that are big enough, they're going to try and establish daily visits by paramedics, social workers, and that sort of thing to support people there. At least that's what's supposed to happen. So that's kind of, it does vary a bit depending on the context, but that's kind of the general overview of how things are going now.
And how is it working? What do we know about the current number of encampments in Toronto and how many people are living in them? And, how does that compare to, say, a year ago or however long ago you want to go back?
So that's a hard question to answer. The reason I say that is the city's data, my editor, Nori Roy, was able to get, it really counts tents. It doesn't count people. So we know, like, for instance, at the height of kind of just before the big encampment evictions in 2021, city data has about 300 or so tents. But each of those tents could have multiple people, and there could be people who are partially living in an encampment and maybe couch surfing somewhere else. So it's really tricky. But what I will say is the number of tents since those big encampment evictions has gone down. What's interesting is that they have started to spread. So in 2021, the biggest encampments by far were all in the downtown core. Fast forward to today, and that's still the case. Like the biggest encampment in late August, which I believe is the latest that we have data for, was still Clarence Park, which is right in the downtown. But what you're starting to see is smaller but more numerous encampments spread throughout kind of the north of the downtown and even into what we would consider the suburbs. I know that's probably not the most satisfactory answer, but I guess the long and the short of it is that compared to 2021, the number of tents are down, but it's really hard to put a figure on how many people there are. And what gets even more complicated is those are just the tents the city knows about. Right? I mean, they're not going out every day necessarily and counting all the tents. They're getting this information from parks workers and what have you. So if you decide to pitch a tent in the middle of the Don Valley in an isolated location, it may not show up. I will add one more thing, though, which is that before the pandemic, if you talk to shelter workers or outreach workers that have been kind of involved for a long time, there have always been parts of kind of the Ravine network in Toronto that have had homeless people. Like, that is not a pandemic phenomenon. That has always been the case. What you're starting to see is more clusters of those people. So, like, instead of 1 or 2 people living on their own, or maybe even 5 or 6 who occasionally camp there, like, you're starting to see, like, concentrations of people in these ravines that are a little more visible, that maybe people are starting to take notice of more in ways that they hadn't in the past.
You mentioned that the relationship between the community and the encampment downtown in Clarence Square was really tense. As these encampments spread and disperse around the city, What is that relationship like in other places? What are residents of encampments like off in the suburbs or off more towards the natural part of the city say about, how they're treated in the community, how they approach the community?
I wouldn't say that suburban residents have a better relationship necessarily. I think what they do have is the advantage of space, of distance that they can put between an encampment and themselves. But Goulding Park, which is one of the parks that was featured in the story, the residents there had been complaining about people, homeless people or people just hanging out in the park. They've been complaining about that for some time.
This is a new phenomenon to them, I guess.
Sort of, but it actually predates the pandemic. I mean, you were starting to see people hanging out in Goulding Park I think it was back in like 2015 or 2016. It's not entirely new, but I think people were starting to pay attention to it more. And I do think that especially when everything was shut down during the pandemic, a lot of the folks there actually are not technically homeless. They do live in public housing, but they wanted a place to hang out that wasn't going to kick them out or wasn't going to judge them for doing what they do. And to them, the park was the best place. So some of them, a couple of them actually were homeless and did live in and around the area. But I'd say that the relationship is different because a lot of people, at least to the experience of Nick and I, a lot of the people who lived or just hung out in that place were actually from the area. So Mark, who is one of the gentlemen that we talked to, who is homeless from Goulding Park, he had lived in that area his whole life. His childhood home was actually not that far away from Goulding Park. So there's a bit of a different relationship, whereas for a lot of people in the downtown encampments, they're from all over. There are people there from outside of the city. There are people there. I mean, David's case, he didn't come to Canada until the mid-2010s. So it's different in that people in suburban encampments do seem, at least to our experience, to have more of a connection to, for instance, local businesses or people in the area. I remember Mark told me once, I don't need to worry about food. I know the pizza guy around the corner. If I need a slice and I'm hungry, he will give it to me. And that's a very different situation from someone who arrives at an encampment who no one likes and they walk into any establishment and people immediately know, oh, you live on the street, we can tell, right? So I'd say that is different, but the homeowners in the area, I would say a lot of them probably would be able to talk to someone who owns a condo near Clarence Square Park and they'd be able to agree on a lot.
Thank you for walking us through this. It's a really fascinating look at what it's actually like for people living in these encampments. And I would encourage folks to go and read the whole piece at the local because it's fantastic. The last thing, though, that I wanted to get at with you is you spent a lot of time with these folks, particularly David, but also a lot of others. What are the things that you want people to understand about the encampments and people who live in them that you don't think has made it properly into the way we discuss them yet?
There's a lot of things.
I would imagine.
Yeah, but I would say the biggest one is, and I think it's been talked about a fair bit, but I think it really bears repeating that the people living in encampments are really not much different from you. And I think what people need to understand is that if you were put in an encampment tomorrow and forced to live in it for a month, a lot of what you currently see as weird or aggressive or even dangerous would make sense. A lot of the behaviors that you see in encampments, even some stuff that can seem upsetting, that can seem dangerous, is being done for survival. And a lot of the people in those encampments, they are just trying to survive. I guess I would also say that, we are not ambitious enough as a city. The piece may come across as a real attack on anyone involved with the city who's trying to help these people. And I think that there are city workers who genuinely do care and who are trying to do the right thing every day. But as a society, we are simply not ambitious enough when it comes to building enough affordable housing, to ensuring that people get the mental health supports they need, to treating housing not as something that, we can put you on a list and you can get it in 4 years, but to say, how do we get you in somewhere next week? And that's a really tall ask. I'm just a writer. I am not a policymaker, but I think people really need to treat that with an urgency that I don't know if we are. I mean, even the people who talk about wanting housing and wanting that, I mean, we can't work on a timeline of years or decades. We have to think about it in like weeks or months. But yeah, I guess those are the two big things. Like we need housing, and also just, it's very easy to dismiss people in encampments. David is, as much as, David has a lot of issues, mental health issues, physical issues, but like when you spend time with someone like him and you see the way he lives, I mean, this isn't the greatest option for you long term, but I understand why you're doing this now, because you aren't really thinking about 5 years from now. Like a lot of us have the luxury of planning our lives 5, 10, 20 years down the road. He's thinking about like, what do I do today or tomorrow? So yeah, I guess those are the two things I'd leave people with.
Brennan, thank you again. Really appreciate you making the time for us. And again, great work.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Brennan Doherty, reporting in The Local. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can, of course, send us feedback on this episode or any other by calling us at 416-935-5935 and leaving us a voicemail, or by sending an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. We're available in all your favorite podcast players, and as you may know, all your smart speakers just ask them to play The Big Story Podcast. Joe Fish is the lead producer of The Big Story. Robin Simon is also a producer on the show. Matt Kesselman is our sound designer. Mary Jubrin is our audience development lead. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Diana Kay is our manager of business development. And I'm your host and executive producer, Jordan Heath Rawlings. We've got an In This Economy for you tomorrow. We've got a throwback episode on Sunday. And myself, Joe, and Robin will be back with a fresh big story on Monday. And we'll talk then.